The city had become a graveyard under the weight of winter. Snow coated the crumbling buildings and filled the empty streets, masking the signs of the life that had once thrived here. I barely remembered the world before all this, before the endless gray skies, before the lines of people scouring ruins for food, before survival became our only purpose. Now each day was defined by the biting cold, by the aching emptiness in our stomachs, and by the small, flickering hope that kept us from giving up. I was among a small group of survivors who had come together almost by accident. We shared a single building, half-burned and abandoned, the roof sagging under layers of snow but still providing some shelter from the icy wind. The place felt like it might collapse at any moment, but for now it was home. That morning, I was huddled in my corner of the main room, wrapped in blankets so worn they were more patches than fabric. The cold gnawed at me, but I'd grown accustomed to it, or maybe I'd just grown numb. Across the room, I saw Emil, a wiry man with sharp eyes and a constant scowl, stoking the fire with bits of wood he'd scavenged from nearby. Next to him sat Mira, an elderly woman wrapped in layers, her fragile frame hidden beneath thick, mismatched clothes. By her side was Peter, a small, thin boy with dark hair and serious eyes, an orphan who had attached himself to Mira the way a lost child clings to any hint of warmth and safety. I wasn't the only one who had noticed how the boy stayed close to her, their bond forming as quietly as snow gathering in silence. In a world that seemed to strip everything away, they had become family to each other. I watched as Mira offered Peter a small crust of bread she had tucked into her coat, her gnarled hands shaking slightly from the cold. Peter hesitated, glancing at her with worry, but she gave him a nod, a gentle smile that softened her lined face. With a quick, grateful look, Peter took the bread, nibbling at it slowly, making each bite last. We all had our own silent agreements when it came to sharing, but Mira and Peter were different. They needed each other in a way that was more than survival. They were each other's reason to hold on, a reminder that life could be more than just making it through another day. I approached them, sitting down next to Mira, who gave me a tired smile. "How's the wood supply?" I asked, glancing over at the small pile Emil had gathered. "Running low as always," she replied, her voice soft but clear. "Emil does what he can, but these streets have been picked clean." Emil grunted, casting a suspicious glance toward the windows as if the cold itself was an enemy lurking outside, waiting for any chance to seep in. "It's not just the wood," he muttered. "The food's nearly gone too. We'll be down to scraps before long." Silence fell over the room, a heavy reminder of our situation. We'd managed to survive this far by pooling our resources, by rationing every crumb, every flicker of warmth. But we all knew the supplies wouldn't last forever. The worst of winter was still ahead, and with each day, the cold grew more merciless. Mira reached into the pocket of her coat, her hands fumbling slightly as she pulled out a small handful of dried berries. She placed them in Peter's hand, closing his fingers around them with a gentle touch. "Eat slowly, my dear," she whispered, her eyes filled with a sadness I understood too well. "We need to make it last." Peter nodded, his face solemn as he picked a berry and slipped it into his mouth, savoring it. It was the first time I'd seen him smile in days, and in that moment, his face transformed, a spark of joy breaking through his usual somber expression. I felt a strange warmth in my chest watching them, a reminder of something that felt almost lost in the cold: kindness, care, the need to protect each other. I leaned closer to Mira, lowering my voice. "Thank you for looking after him. He needs someone." Her gaze softened, and she reached out, patting my hand with a gentleness that belied her strength. "We all need someone," she replied. "Peter reminds me of my son, long gone now, but having him near me, it makes these days a little warmer." The next morning, we were down to the last bits of our food: a few crumbling pieces of bread, a handful of dried vegetables. The fire crackled weakly in the corner, barely enough to keep the frost from creeping into our bones. I could feel the hunger gnawing at me, a dull, constant ache, but I knew the others felt it too. None of us spoke as we shared the little that was left, the silence a heavy reminder of what we faced. But as the fire dwindled, Peter broke the silence. His voice was soft but steady, his words carrying a quiet conviction. "I'll help find more wood today," he said, glancing up at Emil, his small form braced with determination. Emil raised an eyebrow, looking down at Peter with a mix of surprise and respect. "You're a brave kid," he said, nodding. "Stick close to me. It's no easy task in this weather." They set out together, leaving the rest of us in the quiet of the abandoned room. I sat beside Mira, listening to the faint sounds of the wind outside, its howl a constant reminder of how isolated we were. Mira sighed, her gaze distant, her voice filled with the weight of her memories. "When I was young, winters were different," she murmured. "They were times of celebration, of gathering, of warmth. But now, it's as if winter has swallowed the world whole." I placed a hand on her shoulder, offering what little comfort I could. "We have each other," I said softly, my voice steady. "And as long as we share what we have, we'll make it through." Mira looked at me, her eyes bright despite the weariness etched into her face. "You're right. We've all lost so much, but we can still give a little. That's something winter can't take from us." By late afternoon, Emil and Peter returned, their faces red from the cold, their arms filled with small branches and bits of broken furniture they'd managed to scavenge. Peter's eyes shone with pride as he helped Emil pile the wood by the fire, his small contribution a glimmer of hope in our bleak reality. That evening, as the fire crackled a bit brighter, we all gathered around it, the warmth wrapping around us like a fragile but precious gift. Mira leaned close to Peter, whispering a story from her youth, her voice filling the room with a warmth that even the fire couldn't match. It was a simple tale of summers spent in green fields, of family dinners, of a life none of us could imagine now. But as she spoke, I saw something change in Peter's face, a spark of light that had been dimmed by all he'd lost. In that moment, I understood that survival wasn't just about food or firewood. It was about finding ways to keep our hearts from freezing over. It was about sharing memories, stories, whatever warmth we could give to each other. And though we had little, it felt like enough, if only for tonight. When the fire burned down to embers, we each found a place to rest, the cold settling in again as the night deepened. I lay on the hard floor, my body aching, but with a strange sense of peace filling me. We were just a handful of souls in a broken city, but we'd found something in each other that felt like hope. And as I drifted into sleep, I held onto that hope, knowing it was the one thing that would carry us through the long winter ahead. The days that followed were filled with the quiet desperation of survival. Each morning, we'd wake to the unrelenting cold, the frost that crept into every crack, and the hunger that clawed at our insides, sharper with each passing day. Our food was nearly gone, reduced to a few crumbs and what felt like handfuls of dust. Even our firewood was dwindling, and we were down to burning whatever scraps of furniture and broken wood we could find in the surrounding ruins. Peter took to following Emil and me on our scavenging trips. He was still just a boy, but he had learned quickly, his small form moving through the snow with a quiet resilience that broke my heart. I'd caught Mira watching him once, her eyes filled with worry, and knew she feared he was growing up too fast, forced to take on burdens that no child should bear. But Peter rarely complained, his focus and determination more intense with each outing. One morning, as we prepared to leave for another search, Mira pulled me aside, her hand resting on my arm with a gentle, familiar touch. "Look after him," she said, her voice soft. "He's brave, but he's still young, and there's only so much a child should have to carry." I nodded, the weight of her words settling over me. "I'll keep him close," I promised. "He won't come to harm." Myra's expression softened, her hand patting mine before she released me. "Thank you," she murmured. "We're all he has now." The city was a wasteland of broken buildings and empty streets, the snow covering everything like a shroud. Peter, Emile, and I moved through the ruins, our eyes sharp for anything we could use. Scraps of wood, bits of metal, even crumbling plaster that might help us insulate the small room where we slept. Anything to keep the bitter cold at bay. As we scavenged, Peter tugged at my sleeve, his face set with an expression of determination. "Do you think we'll find food?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. I hesitated, glancing down at him, and tried to force a reassuring smile. "Maybe," I said, "we'll find something to bring back to Mira." He nodded, seeming to draw strength from the simple promise. Despite the constant hunger, he always seemed to worry more about Mira than himself. She was his anchor, his only family, and I knew that if he lost her, he would lose the last bit of warmth left in his world. Hours passed as we searched the city, finding only scraps and broken items. As the day wore on, I noticed Emile growing restless, his jaw set, his gaze distant. I had learned to read his silences, to understand that his mind was already racing to the next problem, to the next solution, even when there seemed to be none. Finally, he turned to us, his face set with a grim resolve. "We'll have to go farther," he said, his voice low. "There's an old warehouse on the other side of town. It might have been emptied long ago, but there's a chance it still holds something useful." I glanced at Peter, unsure of taking him so far, but his face was unwavering, his small frame braced with determination. "I'll go," he said, his voice steady. "Mira needs us to bring back something. We can't just go home empty-handed." We moved cautiously through the snow-covered streets, the buildings casting long shadows as the afternoon light faded into the eerie stillness of winter. The warehouse loomed ahead of us, its large doors battered but still intact. Emile pried them open with his crowbar, and a rush of stale, frozen air washed over us as we stepped inside. The space was vast, filled with rows of rusted shelves and scattered debris. We picked our way through the mess, our footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust and grime that covered the floor. The silence pressed down on us, and even Peter seemed tense, his gaze flicking from one shadowed corner to another. Emile moved ahead, his eyes scanning the shelves, his breath visible in the cold air. Suddenly, he paused, reaching for a small, crumpled box wedged between two broken crates. He lifted it slowly, brushing away the dust, revealing a handful of cans, their labels faded but still legible. "Soup," he murmured, a faint glimmer of relief in his eyes. "It's not much, but it's something." Peter's eyes lit up, a rare smile breaking through the worry on his face. I felt a surge of hope as I took one of the cans, the weight of it comforting in my hands. We gathered the remaining cans carefully, placing them in our bags, our movements quickened by the thought of bringing this small victory back to Mira. As we turned to leave, a faint sound broke the silence, the crunch of footsteps on the snow just outside. We froze, each of us exchanging wary glances, our breaths shallow. Emile signaled for us to move to the side, hiding among the shadows of the shelves. 3 figures appeared in the doorway, their forms silhouetted against the dim light filtering in from outside. They were strangers, bundled in layers of mismatched clothing, their faces obscured by scarves. One of them held a makeshift spear, and the others clutched small, rusted blades. They looked as desperate as we felt, their movements tense, their eyes scanning the warehouse with a hunger that mirrored our own. I felt Peter's small hand clutch my arm, his grip tight as we huddled together. Emile glanced at me, his expression calm but guarded, and nodded toward the exit on the far side of the room. Slowly, carefully, we moved through the shadows, slipping between the shelves, our steps muffled by the thick layer of dust. As we neared the door, one of the strangers turned, his gaze sweeping over the shelves, and I held my breath, willing us to remain unseen. We slipped through the doorway just as he turned away, the cold air hitting us like a slap as we emerged back into the open. We didn't speak as we hurried away, our footsteps quick and silent, each of us aware of the precious cargo we carried. When we were finally far enough from the warehouse, Emile exhaled, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "We were lucky," he said, his voice low. "Others are just as desperate as we are. Next time, we may not get away so easily." Peter nodded, his face solemn, but there was a spark of determination in his eyes. "But we have something now," he said, clutching his bag. "Mira will be happy." Back at the building, Myra's face lit up as we showed her the cans of soup, her eyes filling with gratitude and relief. She reached out, pulling Peter into a tight embrace, her voice filled with quiet joy. "Thank you," she murmured, her words barely audible. "You've brought us hope." That night, we shared a small portion of the soup, each sip a comfort, a reminder of what we were fighting to hold on to. The warmth spread through us, pushing back the cold, filling the empty spaces in our hearts. Mira sat close to Peter, her hand resting on his shoulder as they ate, their bond growing stronger with each small act of kindness, each sacrifice they made for one another. In that moment, as I watched them, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, a quiet peace, a sense of belonging. We were bound together, not just by our need for survival, but by the small acts of love and care that we shared in this frozen world. We had become a family, forged in the ashes of winter, bound by a warmth that went deeper than blood. And as long as we had each other, I knew we would find a way to survive. In the days following our discovery at the warehouse, our spirits lifted, if only slightly. Those few cans of soup had been a lifeline, a small reminder that even in the harshest winter, there could still be unexpected moments of grace. We rationed carefully, each of us taking only enough to keep our strength up, our silent understanding to make it last as long as possible. Myra's health, however, had started to falter. Though she hid it well, I could see her slowing down, her breaths coming a little heavier. She tried to mask her cough with a smile, brushing off our concern with her gentle reassurances, but the worry in Peter's eyes betrayed his fear. He had grown so attached to her that I couldn't imagine what her absence might do to him. Their bond was more than just survival now. It was the thread that held him together in this broken world. One afternoon, as I sat by the fire, Peter came over, his face serious, his eyes shadowed with worry. He lowered his voice to a whisper, glancing at Mira, who was resting against a wall, her head tilted back, eyes closed. "Do you think she'll get better?" he asked, his voice barely audible. I hesitated, not wanting to give him false hope, yet not willing to let him lose what little optimism he had left. "Myra's strong, Peter," I said gently. "She's been through a lot, but she's still here with us, and we'll do everything we can to help her get through this." He nodded, his small hands clasped tightly together as if holding onto those words for dear life. "She says it helps when I tell her stories," he murmured. "Stories of warm places, of food and green fields. She says it reminds her of what we're fighting for." I smiled, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Then keep telling her those stories, Peter. They mean more to her than you know." The next morning, as I prepared to join Emil for another trip into the city, Peter slipped something into my hand. A small button, its edges smooth from years of wear, the fabric it once held together long gone. He looked at me earnestly, his eyes full of trust. "It's from her coat," he said. "If you see anyone who might have medicine or something to help her, show them this. They'll know it's for someone important." Touched by his gesture, I tucked the button safely into my coat pocket. "I'll do my best, Peter," I promised, ruffling his hair. "Look after Mira while we're gone." Emil and I moved through the quiet, snow-covered streets, our breaths misting in the cold morning air. The city seemed even more desolate now, the shadows stretching long and empty, and the ever-present silence was broken only by the occasional distant echo of falling rubble. We moved carefully, wary of other scavengers, our senses heightened, always on guard. We made our way toward the marketplace, or what remained of it. Once, this had been the heart of the city, a bustling square filled with merchants and laughter. Now it was a collection of broken stalls, the remnants of a life that felt as distant as a half-remembered dream. As we searched through the ruins, Emil paused, his gaze fixed on a pile of abandoned crates. He reached down, shifting a few pieces of wood, and uncovered a stash of dried herbs and old jars, most of them broken, their contents spilled long ago. But one jar was intact, filled with a dark, thick paste that looked faintly medicinal. "This could be something," Emil muttered, turning the jar in his hands. "Maybe not much, but if it helps with her cough." Hope stirred in my chest, faint but steady. "We'll take it," I said, wrapping the jar carefully. "Anything is worth a try." We continued searching, finding a few other small items. A half-burned candle, a chipped bowl, and, to our surprise, a small sack of oats hidden beneath a pile of debris. It was a modest haul, but in these times, even a handful of oats felt like a miracle. Just as we prepared to leave, we heard footsteps crunching through the snow behind us. Emil's hand shot out, motioning for silence. We ducked behind a wall, our bodies tense, waiting as the sound grew closer. Through a crack in the wall, I saw a figure. A man, tall and thin, wrapped in a tattered coat. He looked around cautiously, his face hidden by a scarf, his movements quick but careful. He didn't appear armed, and something in his posture spoke more of desperation than threat. Emil met my eyes, his expression wary but thoughtful, and after a moment, he stepped out from behind the wall, raising his hand in a show of peace. The man froze, his eyes widening as he took in Emil's calm stance. Slowly, he lowered his scarf, revealing a lined face marked by weariness and hunger. He raised his hands, nodding to us, his voice rough from disuse. "I'm not here to take anything from you," he said. "Just looking for food, like everyone else." I stepped out beside Emil, showing him the small sack of oats. "We have little to spare," I said gently, "but if you're willing to share what you know about the city, we might be able to trade." The man's eyes lit up with a faint hope, and he nodded eagerly. "There's a shelter," he said. An old basement under the hospital on the far side of town. People have been meeting there to share what they have. Supplies, food, whatever they can find. I glanced at Emil, considering the risks. The hospital was farther than we usually traveled, and venturing out that way meant a longer, more dangerous trip. But the possibility of a shelter, a place where people shared, was worth the risk. Emil nodded, reaching into the sack and offering the man a small handful of oats. "Thank you," he said. "We'll consider it." The man accepted the oats gratefully, nodding his thanks before slipping away into the shadows, his footsteps fading into the silence. We returned to Mira and Peter just as the sky began to darken, the cold settling over the city like a heavy blanket. Mira greeted us with a tired smile, her relief clear as she took the jar of medicine Emil had found. "It's not much," he said, watching her carefully, "but maybe it will ease your cough." She nodded, her hand trembling slightly as she opened the jar, the faint scent of herbs filling the room. She took a small spoonful, grimacing at the bitter taste but swallowing it down with determination. Peter watched her closely, his gaze intense, his worry etched into every line of his young face. Mira gave him a reassuring smile, patting his hand. "I'll be all right," she murmured, her voice soft but steady. "This winter won't last forever." As night fell, we huddled around the fire, our small group closer than ever. I told them about the shelter, the possibility of finding others who might have supplies, of building a network of people who, like us, had chosen to survive together. Myra's face lit up at the mention of a community, a faint spark of hope breaking through the fatigue that weighed her down. "People helping each other," she said, her voice filled with wonder. "Maybe we haven't lost everything after all." That night, as we lay down to sleep, I felt the quiet presence of hope settle over us. It wasn't much, just a glimmer in the darkness, but it was enough to warm the cold edges of our hearts. And as I drifted off, the image of a brighter tomorrow stayed with me, filling the shadows with the promise of a new beginning, even in the ashes of winter. The following morning dawned cold and gray, the sky blanketed with clouds that seemed to press down on the city, as if even the heavens bore the weight of our struggle. Emil and I decided to take the risk and head toward the shelter the stranger had mentioned. Myra's cough had worsened overnight, and even with the small jar of herbs, her strength was fading. Peter stayed close to her, his young face etched with worry, holding her hand as though his very touch could keep her here, tethered to this fragile existence. "Be careful," Mira whispered as we prepared to leave, her eyes soft but firm. "This place will be colder without you." I gave her a reassuring smile, my hand resting briefly on her shoulder. "We'll be back before dark," I promised, glancing at Peter, who nodded solemnly, as if pledging to look after her in our absence. Emil and I moved quickly, winding through the desolate streets, our breaths misting in the frigid air. The hospital was on the far side of the city, an area we rarely ventured into since it was often patrolled by desperate scavengers and the occasional group of looters. But the promise of others like us, others who still held onto the small comforts of kindness and cooperation, drove us forward. As we reached the hospital, I felt a shiver run down my spine. The building loomed before us, its windows shattered, walls scorched and crumbling. It had once been a place of healing, a sanctuary, but now it stood as a hollow shell, stripped of warmth and hope. I glanced at Emil, who nodded, his gaze steady, and we made our way inside. The entrance hall was dark and silent, our footsteps echoing off the cracked tiles as we moved cautiously through the shadows. We followed the stranger's directions, descending a narrow stairwell that led to the basement, our nerves taut as we moved deeper into the building. At the bottom of the stairs, We heard voices, quiet murmurs, hushed tones that spoke of caution but not hostility. We entered a dimly lit room, where a small group of people huddled together around a weak fire, their faces shadowed but warm with recognition as they saw us. A tall woman with a calm, measured gaze approached, nodding in greeting. "Welcome," she said softly, her voice carrying a strength that belied her worn appearance. "You must be new to this side of town. I'm Clara." I introduced myself, and Emile did the same, our relief evident as we realized this was indeed the shelter we'd been told about. The people here looked as weary as we felt, but in their faces, I saw a glimmer of resilience, a spark of solidarity that felt like the very essence of survival. "We've been gathering supplies," Clara explained, gesturing to a few crates stacked in the corner. "It isn't much. Mostly scraps, herbs, a few tools, but we share what we have. You're welcome to take what you need." Her words filled me with gratitude, and I thought of Mira and Peter, waiting for us back at our own shelter. "Thank you," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "We have an elderly woman with us. She's been ill, and we could use any herbs or food you can spare." Clara nodded, her gaze softening. She walked over to one of the crates, rummaging through its contents until she found a small bundle of dried herbs and a tightly wrapped package of bread. She placed them in my hands, her expression gentle but firm. "Take this," she said, "and tell her she has friends here, should she ever need them." Emile and I exchanged a glance, both of us realizing the significance of her offer. In a world that had become so fractured, so cold, Clara's kindness felt like a bridge, a way of reminding us that we were not alone. For a moment, I allowed myself to hope that perhaps we could build something lasting here, a network of people who could rely on each other, even in the harshest of winters. Before we left, a young man named Leo approached, his face thin but kind. "If you're from the other side of town, you must have passed the old market," he said, glancing at me and Emile. "Rumor has it there's a group of families there, traders, who might still have supplies." We thanked him for the tip, the promise of more resources a glimmer of hope. The thought of Mira and Peter motivated every step back through the city's empty streets, the wind cutting through us like a knife, but our spirits buoyed by the support we'd found. When we arrived back at our shelter, Peter's face lit up, his eyes wide with relief as he saw the herbs and bread we'd brought. He darted over to Mira, sitting close beside her, his expression filled with gratitude as she took the herbs, her face softening with a faint smile. "You found all this?" she asked, her voice weak but filled with wonder. "We met people who care, like us," I replied, watching as she took a small sip of tea made from the herbs. "People who share what little they have. There's a whole network out there, a shelter of souls still holding on to hope." Myra's eyes misted as she looked at Peter, her hand resting on his shoulder. "You see, Peter, even in a world like this, there are still those who would share their last crumb. That's a kind of warmth no winter can take." As the evening wore on, we sat around our small fire, the bread and tea lifting our spirits, our bodies warmed by both the heat and the hope that had begun to bloom in our hearts. Myra's voice grew stronger, and with a gentle smile, she began telling Peter one of her stories, of a spring that would come, of flowers that would bloom, of the life that might one day return to this place. Her voice filled the room, wrapping around us like a blanket, and in that moment, I realized something profound. Survival wasn't just about rationing supplies or finding warmth in the cold. It was about these moments of connection, of sharing our burdens and our joys, of remembering what it meant to be human. Before we drifted off to sleep, Peter slipped his small hand into Myra's, holding tightly. I watched as she looked down at him, her eyes filled with a fierce, protective love. They had become family, not by blood, but by something deeper, by choice, by need, by the unbreakable bonds forged in hardship. I lay back, the cold air pressing in but feeling lighter than before. In the silence, I held on to the image of Clara and the others, of the kindness that had bridged the distance between us. And as sleep took hold, I dreamed of a city that might one day rise from these ashes, filled not with the scars of winter, but with the warmth we had fought so hard to keep alive. A quiet resolve filled our small group in the days that followed. The herbs and bread we'd received had strengthened Mira, her cough easing with each passing day, though her energy remained fragile. The knowledge that there were others nearby, people willing to share and help, was like a second fire, warming our spirits as the cold deepened. Emile and I took turns visiting the shelter in the hospital basement, trading bits of what we could spare for food, and sometimes simply gathering to share news, to hear stories that reminded us of life before the city had fallen. Peter had taken on the habit of joining Emile on his scavenging trips. At first, Mira protested, worried about the boy's safety, but Peter was insistent, his small shoulders squared with purpose. He had become our determined protector, carrying himself with a seriousness that belied his age. Each time he returned with something small, a handful of sticks for the fire, a single can, a discarded blanket. His pride shone, as if he'd conquered the city itself. One evening, as the wind howled against the walls of our shelter, Emile leaned over the fire, his face illuminated by its glow, his eyes reflecting the resolve we'd all come to share. If we're going to keep surviving, we need to build more than a handful of friendships, he said, his voice quiet but firm. We need a real community, one that can endure through this winter and whatever comes after. Mira nodded, her gaze far off as she considered his words. In the old days, there were winter gatherings, she murmured, her voice soft with memory. People would come together to share food, warmth, and songs. The cold wasn't as harsh when it was shared. Peter, who sat close beside her, looked up, his face filled with a spark of curiosity. Could we do that? Bring people together? Emile and I exchanged glances, the thought lingering between us like an ember. With enough people willing to share what little they had, maybe we could not only survive this winter but begin something lasting, something strong enough to carry us through whatever came next. The decision was made quietly, a shared understanding that this small act of hope was worth the risk. Emile and I spent the next days visiting each shelter we knew of, extending cautious invitations to a gathering in our own building. Clara was the first to agree, her face lighting up with a warmth that had been hidden beneath the weight of winter. People need something to hold on to, she said, something to remind them that we're stronger together than apart. On the evening of the gathering, we readied our shelter with quiet anticipation. Emile stoked the fire until it burned brightly, casting a warm glow over the cold walls, while Peter arranged blankets and seats, his face flushed with excitement. Mira prepared a small pot of tea, her hands steady, her movements filled with purpose. Her strength seemed to have returned, her spirit uplifted by the thought of this gathering, of rekindling something that felt almost forgotten. As dusk fell, the first of our guests arrived, their faces wary but hopeful as they stepped into the room. Clara entered with a small group, each carrying a modest offering. Some potatoes, a handful of dried herbs, even a small candle that cast a flickering light over the room. Others followed, each one bringing something, each item a piece of themselves, a gift to the shared warmth we were creating. Soon, the room was filled with quiet voices, murmurs of gratitude. the occasional laugh breaking the silence as people began to talk, to share stories of life before the war. They spoke of family dinners, of summer festivals, of laughter echoing down streets that were now hollow and abandoned. And as the fire crackled, as the warmth spread, I saw faces soften, the lines of hardship easing for the first time in months. Peter sat close to Mira, his eyes wide with wonder as she recounted a story from her youth. A tale of a winter celebration, of a night filled with songs and lanterns, of people coming together under a starlit sky. Her voice was strong, filled with the richness of her memories. And as she spoke, I saw the room settle into a quiet peace. Each of us carried to a place beyond this cold, beyond the hunger, beyond the fear. Then, in a soft voice, Peter began to sing. His voice barely more than a whisper at first, hesitant, but then stronger as the warmth of the room encouraged him. It was an old lullaby, one I hadn't heard in years, a song about stars guiding lost travelers home. His voice filled the room, lifting each of us, reminding us of a life that was still possible, a life we could create together. One by one, others joined in, their voices blending with Peter's, the sound a soft, fragile harmony that wrapped around us like a blanket, warming us from the inside out. The song rose and fell, weaving through the cracks in the walls, carrying with it the promise of resilience, of strength that went deeper than any winter. As the song faded, a quiet peace settled over the room, a warmth that felt almost tangible. People leaned into one another, sharing quiet conversations, their faces softened by the glow of the fire. For the first time since the start of winter, I felt a deep, unshakable hope, a belief that this small community, forged in hardship, could be a foundation for something greater. Mira looked over at me, her gaze filled with gratitude. "This," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, "this is what we've been fighting for." I nodded, understanding that her words held a truth that ran deeper than survival. We were more than just bodies struggling to endure. We were a gathering of hearts, a shelter of souls, and as long as we stood together, we could withstand anything. That night, as the others slowly left, returning to their own corners of the city, they each carried a piece of that warmth with them. Emil, Mira, Peter, and I sat by the dying fire, our silence comfortable, the bond between us stronger than ever. Peter leaned against Mira, his eyes drooping with sleep, and she held him close, her arms a gentle shelter against the world's harshness. In the quiet, as I watched the embers glow, I knew that no matter how long this winter lasted, we would survive it, because we had created something stronger than fear, stronger than hunger. We had created a home in each other, a place where warmth would always be shared, where kindness would always be the answer to the cold. And in that shared warmth, in the gentle rise and fall of Myra's breath as she held Peter close, I saw a future that was worth every step, every sacrifice, every small act of hope.